Hello and welcome to UO Today. I'm Barbara Altman, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. Our guest today is Stacy Bannerman, author of When the War Came Home, The Inside Story of Reservists and the Families They Leave Behind from 2006. Bannerman is a founding member of Military Families Speak Out, an organization of military families that actively protests the war that their loved ones are fighting. Bannerman is an advocate for troops and their families. She has testified before Congress seeking to improve support services for military families during all phases of combat deployments and comprehensive post-combat care for veterans. Bannerman gave a talk titled "The War at Home: What America's Longest War Has Shown Us About Who We Are and Who We Can Become." That was on October 18, 2011 at the U of O, and in Portland the following day. Her talk is the Oregon Humanities Center 2011-12 SADC Lecture and is part of the Center's Conflict series. Stacy, we're glad to have you.
Oh, I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
You travel a lot.
I do.
It's good of you to come to Eugene and Portland. So
it's a beautiful day you're having.
It is a very nice time of year, yeah. I want to leap right into the middle of this and ask you what your personal stake in this is.
My personal stake in this is that I'm married to a two-time Iraq War combat veteran. He's got 27 years of service in the Army National Guard, including a couple of years on active duty status, and as it said, 2 tours in Iraq. So when the war came home, for me, it came right into my front living room.
Your husband's name is Lauren, right?
Yes.
Yeah. I loved the setup of your book when you talk about how deeply shocking it was that he was called up to active duty. He was into his 40s, I believe, at that time.
Yes.
And you're very vivid in your description of the devastating realizations that came with the fact that he was being shipped off to active duty. Can you talk about that moment and how it catapulted you into what you're doing now?
Well, I'd be happy to talk about that moment, but I do want to point out, I mean, let's keep in mind that even Defense Secretary Gates acknowledged that they being the Pentagon, the DoD, had really kind of pulled a bait and switch on our citizen soldiers, and this is the Defense Secretary's words, not mine. But he acknowledged that they'd really pulled a bait and switch, on our citizen soldiers who did sign up for 1 weekend a month and 2 weeks a year, and who historically have not been deployed in these kinds of numbers, and certainly not for multiple deployments. So when my husband walked through the door at my work, goodness, I guess this was back in 2003, it would have been almost exactly 8 years ago today.
Goodness.
Yes, when he walked through the door, I was working at a program promoting peace and nonviolence in the schools, in our elementary schools. And he walked through the door and he said, "I got the call." And I knew exactly what he meant in that moment, even though we hadn't talked about the possibility of him being deployed for months, because it literally was not a possibility for us. And in that moment, everything begins to change. And that was when my life and our lives took off on a whole different path. And for me, that path has been involved protesting the war in Iraq, which we know is a war of choice, not a war of necessity. It has also involved being an advocate for our troops and our veterans and our military families. We as a nation have got a responsibility morally and ethically, democratically, really, to be keeping our promises and commitments to the 1% of this population that's been bearing the burden of 100% of 2 wars for over 10 years.
I want to skip ahead and ask you how Lauren is now.
Lauren now is home, and he is retired, and he is currently employed at the VA, and he is pursuing a degree. The GI Bill has really been a godsend, and we're just happy that he made it back home, and we're together and looking to move forward with the next phase of our lives.
Do you want to say anything about how his 2 tours, how his deployment affected him?
Well, what I want to say is this. People need to understand that while, yes, these wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, because they don't have front lines, because they have required lengthy, multiple deployments from a lot of the same troops, nearly 50% of our soldiers have served multiple tours in Iraq. Some have served as many as 12 tours. 12. That's unprecedented. That is absolutely unheard of. And we know that multiple tours and lengthy tours directly contribute to the likelihood of development of post-combat stress. We know that for a fact. And we certainly are already seeing that in terms of the percentages of returning veterans who do have post-combat stress, at least 1 in 5, according to the official records. And frankly, that's much, much higher. We know it's much higher in our Guard and Reserve veterans. So, but whether or not a veteran comes home with a psychological wound or physical injury, the fact of the matter is that war changes everyone.
Not only those who have been on the active lines, but also those to whom they come home?
Absolutely. There's no way that you, as a military family member, are not impacted and changed, by this churn cycle, which is what we call the period of, the mobilization, when we get the orders, and then pre-deployment, and then the actual deployment itself, and then coming home and the reintegration process, and then we get the call again, and then we begin the whole churn cycle again.
Churn cycle.
Churn
wow,
cycle.
That's a very telling phrase, isn't it?
Yes.
Everything's churning. Yeah.
Yes, it is.
I wanted to ask you to talk about a really great phrase that you used with me in conversation. You talked about the epidemic of disconnection, and that's really what your work is, right? Fighting the epidemic of disconnection?
Certainly it is, and really on some level it always has been about that, because for the first time in modern history, when the United States began the War on Terror in 2001, it went to war without a draft, without a war tax, without war bonds, without rationing, without major publicity and outreach campaigns that were government sponsored, without mobilizing industry and any number of other things. That was absolutely unprecedented. The United States, when we declared war, I really thought that the nation was going to be going with our men and women in uniform, but in fact they have not. And as a result of that, because we've got just 1% of the population, as I've said, bearing 100% of the burden of this war, people have not felt the weight of this war. They've not been connected to it. They don't know anyone. During World War II, one person, one of every 5 households at any given time had a loved one deployed in combat in World War II. That 1 in 5. During Vietnam, I believe it was 1 in 10. During the War on Terror, America's longest war, it is less than 1 in 100. Now imagine that. Imagine that. And so the majority of the civilians, the population in this nation, people aren't touched by the war. They aren't impacted. They don't live with it. We're not even really seeing it on the news. It's not part of our national conversation. It's not been part of the past election of 2010. It's for 99% of the population, the wars don't exist. They're not going on. But for the 1% of us, they are constantly. And even when our loved ones come home, it doesn't mean the war ends. It means a whole new battle begins.
So talk about that, if you would. That's a wonderful segue into what is it like for this 1% to come back to this country and try to reintegrate?
Well, as I said, everyone has changed. War and combat is really it's a one-way street, and there's no way you can't come back that same road. And of course our families have been changed as well. We know that our military families now, their rates of mental health issues are comparable to that of our actual troops.
Within the families of the vets?
That is correct.
That's another kind of epidemic, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
Yes, it is. And so our soldiers are, and of course Marines and airmen and coasties, who want to give a shout out to the Coast Guard, and sailors are coming home, and they've been living in a very high intensity environment in which they're surrounded by their battle buddies, and every single day it's real simple in that you are either alive or dead. And then coming home and trying to reintegrate into a household. And, most of our troops are married. And again, that also has not been the case in, previous wars. Most of our troops are married. About half of them have got children. Again, not the case in previous wars. And they're coming home and trying to reconnect and reintegrate, with a family that has also changed over the period of that deployment, whether it was 6 months or 12 months or 18 months, or in the case of the Minnesota National Guard, who served the longest tour in Iraq, 22 months. So that's difficult, coming off the rush and the adrenaline of that combat theater, of that war zone. There are adjustments to be made, and the very things that keep you alive and functional in a combat zone and make you a very, very, very good soldier do not necessarily translate well into making you a really great husband all the time. So it's difficult, and obviously, especially with our citizen soldiers coming home, it's illegal, but so many of them have lost their jobs because they've had multiple deployments, whether it's an employer that fires them, or whether it's because they were a small business owner, and over the course of a decade of war and multiple tours, they've just not been able to keep that business going at home while they were in Iraq or Afghanistan. We unfortunately, we've got the highest wound to kill ratio ever that we've ever had, and what I mean by that, and it's fantastic, the advances with the military medicine and in the evacuation of the real seriously wounded warrior, off the battlefield, and into triage care, and then getting them out to Landstuhl, Germany, getting them taken care of. The advances are absolutely remarkable. I remember one night in between tours, my husband sat down, and all the guys and women, guys and gals that go, and about 10% of veterans of these wars right now are female, and those numbers are just going to continue to climb. These women vets come back with their own issues and challenges, one of them being their divorce rate is about 3 times that of male veterans. But I recall one night my husband and I sitting around, this was between deployments, and he pulled out this whole big kit, medical kit, basic kit that all of these guys have on the battlefield that they're trained to use. But because of these advances, what that means is we've got a wound to kill ratio that is at least 3 times higher, possibly 5 times higher than it's ever been in any previous war. And wound to kill ratio means that for every service member that is killed, X number are wounded. So, I think it was about a 1-to-1 or 1-to-1 or so in during the first World Wars, World War I and World War II. In Vietnam, it was a 1-to-3. For every service member killed in Vietnam, 3 were wounded. What we've got right now with the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the wound-to-kill ratio in these wars, and the numbers depending on the wars, but we're looking at anywhere from 1 to 8 to 1 to 15.
Wow.
Yes. And what that means is, and these are major injuries. I mean, we've got guys coming home with multiple amputations, guys that literally, obviously, would not have lived on a battlefield before. And these guys are coming home and are going to require a whole different level of care than we've ever had to provide, for, in terms of percentages and for this number of soldiers. I mean, there are 4 Marines that came home with no legs and no arms. And I think about their families. And I think about the caregiver burden that these families, and it's primarily the women, it's the wives and the moms. We know that the caregiver burden, the stress, anxiety, suicidal ideation even, of caregivers of injured veterans is more than double that of caregivers of non-veterans. And they're going to be living with this. There's very little support. And these families are going to be living with this also for the rest of their lives.
Let's talk about support. Has anything gotten better? Has anything improved in the services available to returning vets?
Absolutely, no
English
question.
Or otherwise?
Absolutely, and I want to, in terms of America has gotten some things really right.
What have we gotten right?
Right. What we've gotten really right is the GI Bill. What we've gotten really right is that we are not, regardless of how this nation feels about these wars, that we are not doing what we did to our returning warriors like we did during Vietnam. America has done beautifully on that. There's absolutely no question. And in terms of the veterans' care, I think, the Walter Reed, when that big story broke in the Washington Post back in 2007, at that time I was actually living in Washington, D.C. for about 4 months. It was my own temporary duty. Living in Washington, D.C. at that time for about 4 months, advocating for our veterans and our families to improve post-combat care and services. And because of that Walter Reed story breaking, that really raised the profile. And the VA has made great strides. Make no mistake about it. There's still much work to be done. But the VA has made some really great strides in terms of providing the services for the veterans, working to reduce the backlog. It still exists. I'm not gonna paint a real pretty picture here, but I do want to say a lot of progress has been made. The VA has done wonderful in terms of dealing with physical injuries and providing some very innovative therapies. They've still got some work to do in terms of providing the psychological therapies, because the tendency remains within that system by and large, not everywhere. The tendency, though, is still to just medicate. And that ultimately is not the solution. I'm not saying that there is not a time and a place and a need for prescription medication. I wholeheartedly believe that that is one tool, but let's not make it the whole toolbox, and that's what they are still doing.
Let me just make sure I understood. Your time in D.C. was when you were giving evidence to congressional committees. Is that correct?
I was doing that. I've testified before the United States Congress, I believe 3 times, possibly 4.
That's what my notes said, 3, but I'll take your word for it.
So it's 3 times, possibly 4. I've also testified before the Oregon State Legislature several times and provided testimony for state legislature hearings in Alaska and elsewhere. And with that testimony, there's also been a lot of I'm gonna call it volunteer advocacy because I don't get paid. I'm not a lobbyist. Lobbyists get paid. I don't get paid. I do this because it needs to be done.
So you've testified on the national level, you've worked on the state level in various different states. I want to make sure before we run out of time that we get a chance to talk about the initiatives that you have spearheaded that aren't to do with state or national government. Can you explain the mission of the Sanctuary for Veterans and Families?
The Sanctuary for Veterans and Families is a small 501c3 organization. We were established actually in 2007. Our website is sanctuaryvf.org. And the mission of the Sanctuary for Veterans and Families, we're a nonpartisan organization. We are not pro-war, we are not pro-peace. We are pro-military family, we are pro-veteran, we are pro-troops. And so our mission is to provide advocacy and support, referrals, and wellness programs and reintegration projects and services for our veterans and military families. We do things like we provide a Camp Howdy for military kids, where we bring in local Guard kids and children of veterans and other military kids, and they can attend a day camp with other military children, which too many of them don't have access to when they're in the Guard and all of that. And the kids get to hang out with other military kids, have some fun, learn some basic horsemanship skills, and get a little bit of recreational riding time in there as well. We also do sanctuary weekends for women veterans, one of the first gender-specific retreats for women veterans in this country. We provide a Blue Star brunch for our military wives and our caregivers of veterans, because really, they're really the heart of the Army, and they're the ones who are holding together that family, the military family, the veterans family. In fact, virtually every study that I've come across, and I've read a lot of them, is shown that all things being held equal, the single most critical factor in both the well-being of the soldier during deployment and the military child during the deployment is that military spouse. Those studies also, other studies also prove, all else being held equal, the single most critical factor in the successful recovery and reintegration and readjustment of that veteran is that military spouse. It is that caregiver. But unfortunately, we don't have a lot of programs or services for the spouses or for the caregivers. There's not funding out there, but we felt it was so important. I'm a military spouse. I'm the wife of a veteran. I know what it's like. And so the Sanctuary for Veterans and Families is providing programs and taking care of the people who are taking care of our troops and our military kids and our veterans.
It's a well-named program.
Thank you.
There's so many things I wanted to follow up on, but I do want to ask you, because some Portland viewers will be familiar with another piece of your work. Can you just briefly describe Homefront 911?
Homefront 911, Military Family Monologues, is a kind of a performance art piece. I put it together. It's a series of monologues based on actual events. These are interviews and stories that I've collected from military families all over the United States. These are stories about 10 years of wars coming home. Homefront 911 is presented by military family members in the hopes that we can begin to provide a cure for the epidemic of disconnection between our military and civilian communities, to help America understand that when our troops went to war, we did too. and we're performing Homefront 911 at the United States Capitol building at 12 noon on Thursday, November 17th. I'm unbelievably excited about this opportunity. I'm grateful to all of the military family members who have given so generously of their heart and their time and volunteered to be a part of Homefront 911 because really, as I've said, 10 years ago, our loved ones went to war and our families did too.
I've seen video of you performing in 911, and you are a powerful voice. It looks as though you really are in your element on that stage. You at home there?
I am, yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. We only have a couple of minutes left, but I have a big question for you. I'm a little unfair to ask you to answer this briefly, but we talked about the importance of you remaining impartial in your work. Can you just sum that up as a way to close out our discussion?
Well, it's about to the best, and certainly, you know, with a nonprofit, obviously, because the reality is I do wear a couple of different hats, but you know, our troops did not sign up to serve President Bush, and they did not sign up to serve President Obama. Our troops signed up to serve the people of the United States of America. So these are not partisan issues. They truly are not. And I have found, while I will challenge certain politicians, and I will challenge policies. That's part of my responsibility as a member of a democracy. And as my husband always said, if we're fighting for democracy over there, what's the problem with my wife engaging it over here?
Wow. That's a great place to end, actually, and that's a very wonderful distillation of his relationship to your work. So thank you for answering a question I didn't even have a chance to ask.
No.
Stacy, we have to close here. This has been great. I wish we had another half hour.
It has. I could keep talking. I'll be quiet.
Thank you so much.
You're
and
welcome.
we will be
Thank you.
taping your talk so viewers can watch your presentations as well.
Thank you.
We've been speaking with Stacy Bannerman, an advocate for troops and their families and the author of When the War Came Home, the Inside Story of Reservists and the Families They Leave Behind. Bannerman gave a talk titled The War at Home, What America's Longest War Has Shown Us About Who We Are and Who We Can Become, on October 18th, 2011 at the U of O and in Portland the following day. Her talk is the Oregon Humanities Center 2011 12th Tzedek Lecture and part of the Center's Conflict Series. Thanks for watching and see you next time.